Hello, my name is Kim and I'm with the Shared Spaces team here at the University of Saskatchewan. In this first of two tutorials looking at the Nomad Sculpt modeling app, we will be importing a 3D scan of an object and manipulating this by changing the shape of the mesh, by adding digital paint, and stamping alpha textures, all which can be done on models imported with or without their photographic textures. You can use this process for any existing 3D model that you wish to alter. You can find free Creative Commons 3D models online if you do not have an existing model to work with. Alternatively, you can look for our series on scanning 3D objects on our Shared Spaces YouTube channel or website. If you are totally new to working in 3D space, we recommend starting with our Terminology and Basics of Working in 3D tutorial. I'm going to begin by opening the App Store and then clicking on the search button at the bottom right. And then in the search bar, I am going to type in Nomad, Nomad, and then the first result shows Nomad Sculpt. And you can just see the app available for download on the top right. So this is the store page for Nomad Sculpt. One thing I just wanted to mention is that this app is great in terms of privacy since it doesn't collect any of your data. So I'm just going to begin by opening up the Nomad app, and here we can see that there's a grid view. I'm just going to kind of reorient myself, and this shows your 3D space along the X, Y, and Z coordinates. First, I would like to point out a button at the top left of the screen. If you press the leftmost button, it will bring up the following menu. I'm just going to quickly go to the manual because it is very, very useful and explains a lot of information in a quite succinct way. Now I'm going to click on the Tools tab, which is on the bottom left of the screen. Because it can be a bit overwhelming familiarizing yourself with the various tools, the Tools section is extremely helpful. It gives an overview showing how to alter the settings of the tools. And then a bit further down, it shows videos of the effects that each tool has and gives a brief explanation of what each tool does, which I find is really useful because sometimes if you just try out the tools, it might not be totally obvious exactly what they are doing to your model. So now I'm going to navigate back to the app, and I just want to begin by explaining how to move around in the space. So you can drag one finger to kind of rotate the area that you see here that's a grid. There's this kind of sphere in the top right that is red, green, and blue. You can use it to change the way that you view the scene. Now I'm going to add a sphere to the scene. You can add objects to your scene by tapping the button in the top left, which is third from the left. This shows you a variety of common shapes that you can use as building blocks for 3D modeling. I'm just going to go ahead and add a sphere to my scene. So you can pan side to side, up and down by dragging two fingers up and down, left and right, zooming in by pinching and spreading your fingers, or zooming out by doing the opposite. Now I'm going to select the Gizmo tool, which is in the top right toolbar. In Nomad Sculpt, this is the tool that you use to alter the transform of your object. So that includes moving it, rotating it, and scaling it. If you want to move it, you can use the 3 colored arrows, and each arrow just has a different color depending on the axis that it is moving your object. You can also use the colored squares to translate your model across the different axes. When you move your model this way, it displays a sort of tether line to show which position your model started in. You can also use the peach-colored dot in the center to move the object freely in space. To scale your object on the different axes, you can press and drag the various circle icons. Dragging toward the center of the object will decrease the scale, while dragging away from the center will increase the scale. If you want to scale your object as a whole, which includes all of the axes, you can press and drag on the outermost circle that encloses your object. Just like before, dragging inwards towards the center of the object will decrease its size, while dragging outwards away from the center of the object will increase its size. If you would like to rotate your object on the different axes, there are the 3 different colored curved lines that you can use to rotate your object. If you would like to rotate your object based on your current point of view, you can do this by pressing and dragging the innermost circle. So once you've gotten your object to the position, rotation, and scale that you like, you will want to click on the Validate button, which is at the top center, and this will open up the toolbar on the top right, which allows you to select the different tools. If you would like to change your view of the toolbar, you can press the wrench icon that's in the top right. This will give you more space to work on your object, but because the icons are now lined up, you'll have to scroll up and down to access all of them. Another helpful way to get more screen space is to tap 4 fingers at once, which will toggle the UI elements, like the various menus and buttons. Again, that's tapping all 4 fingers at once. Before we jump into importing 3D scans, I'm going to briefly go over a couple of the topology tools, which you can use to either increase or decrease the number of polygons on your model. Here, I have enabled wireframe mode, so it's easier to see how detailed the mesh of the sphere is. Near the top left, you can see the stats of the sphere, which contains just over 6,000 vertices. This is a relatively small number of vertices and is easily within the ideal range for bringing into augmented reality apps, such as shared spaces. If your model has a high number of vertices, it may not be possible to import depending on the app. If you open the Topology tab and select Dyn Topo, you can use this feature to reduce your polygon count on certain parts of your model. To do this, make sure that the decimation method is selected and then set the detail to a value less than 100%. You might have to play around with the detail percentage a bit to determine the amount of decimation you would like. As I mentioned earlier, you can undo any changes quickly by tapping 2 fingers on the screen. If you would like to reduce the polygon count of your entire model, you can navigate to the Miscellaneous section in the Topology tab. Similar to Dyn Topo, you will set a percentage value for how much you would like to reduce the polygon count of your model. Depending on how detailed your model is, pressing Decimate may not make a major visual difference at first. Here, as I press Decimate several times, you can see the effect become more obvious. These are just a couple of ways to alter the polygon count in Nomad Sculpt. There are many more features to play around with in the Topology tab, so I encourage you to experiment on your own. Now we're going to look at how to import a 3D model into our project. First, I'm going to press on the file folder icon at the top left. Under the heading Import, I press the Open button. In my files, I have created a folder of 3D scans from each of the 3D scanning apps we have covered in our scanning tutorial videos. I will be focusing exclusively on OBJ files, but you may have a different experience depending on what type of file you're importing. This first model comes from the Luma AI app, and I have it stored as a zip file. I'll select this file, then press the Open button at the top right. As you can see, the model has imported with its material. Sometimes materials need to be added manually, which we'll see shortly. While this model is mostly intact, you can see that there are some areas where the mesh has holes and where the material is missing, such as the nose and one of the eyes. 3D scans might look great on the apps that capture them, but unfortunately sometimes the detail does not transfer perfectly to other apps. Next, I'm opening a 3D scan made with the WideR app. As you can see, this model is not zipped, so I will be selecting all 3 files you see here and then pressing Open. As you can see, the model has imported, but the material is missing. The model looks relatively decent, although there is a hole in the bottom of the mesh, most likely from what the Sage bundle was resting upon. This is quite normal for models from 3D scanning apps. To add the material, I'm going to press on the Material button, which is at the top left, exactly in the center. Here, I'll scroll down to Textures and press on the empty box on the line labeled Color. Next, I'll choose Files. Then inside the same folder I imported the model from, I will select the texture file, which is usually a PNG or other image file type. Now the Sage bundle has its material and the imported scan is complete. Next, I'm going to import a 3D scan done using the Scaniverse app. Just like the Sage bundle, this model is unzipped, so I will select all 3 files and open them. Again, the material has not opened with the model, so I will need to manually add it. I'll select the Materials tab near the top left, scroll down to Textures, click on the box next to Color, go to Files, navigate to the Models folder, then select and open the image file. Finally, I'm going to import a model scanned with the Curie Engine app. Like the last 2 models, I have this one saved as multiple files, so I'm going to go ahead and open all of them. This time, the material has been successfully applied to the model. When I open the Materials tab, you can see that there is already an image selected in the color setting. Now I'm going to go through using some of the tools on an imported model, which will alter its shape, color, and texture. I brought in the star lamp model again, but without the texture, so I can add some paint to it later. So here you can see that the scan has some pieces that aren't part of the star. So I'm going to begin by cleaning up the mesh a bit. To do this, I'm going to use the trim tool. On the left-hand side, there are some settings for the trim tool which determine the shape the trim tool creates as you use it. I'm going to select the lasso tool since it gives a bit more freedom of movement. With this tool selected, I'm drawing just around the edges of the mesh that I want to trim off. This process can be a bit tedious as you'll likely need to zoom in and out and rotate around your model to get a good angle. When you have the trim tool selected, you can still zoom with the pinching gesture and pan around with 2 fingers. But to rotate, you'll need to either select a different tool like clay, which I do here, or on the left-hand side where you select the setting for the trim tool, click on the View button. Now that the star is more tidied up, I'm going to start by using the Smooth tool. As you'd expect, this tool is used to smooth the mesh based on the average of the point positions. If you have a mesh with a lower number of polygons, the smoothing effect will be more dramatic. But if you have a mesh with a high polygon density, so something with a high resolution, the smoothing effect may not be as apparent. I'm just going to go around, smoothing out all of the faces of the star. Right now, I don't have the mirror setting applied, so the smoothing is only happening on one side of my model. If I click on the Sim or Symmetry button on the left, I can get my smoothing done faster since I'm working on 2 sides at once. The changes may not be exactly the same, however, if your model is not symmetrical. So you may need to double check your model as you work, or perhaps even abandon the symmetry setting depending on your model. Next, I'm selecting the clay tool, which I can use to either add material or remove it from my model. To toggle between the additive and subtractive modes, you will click on the Sub button on the left-hand side. As I mentioned before, sometimes the symmetry setting won't work perfectly if your object isn't perfectly symmetrical. Here you can see that even though I'm removing material on the left, the material on the right is still jutting out. To deal with this, I'll need to turn off symmetry mode and edit this area separately. The brush tool is similar to the clay tool, except that it doesn't leave as much texture, and it limits the amount of volume you can add or remove. The move tool can be used to create elastic deformation in your model. The area of your model being moved is maintained as you drag it, so you can return your model to its original position if you wish. The drag tool also creates elastic deformation, but unlike the move tool, the part of your model that is selected is updated continuously. This allows you to create longer shapes with a greater sense of movement. Next is the Inflate tool, which expands the selected mesh, somewhat like a balloon, or deflates it if you have the subsetting on. Here I'm going to enable dynamic topology, or Dyne Topo, which will allow me to add more polygons to my mesh as I use the Inflate tool. So this will allow me to get more detail. I'm going to make a pair of eyes for what will be a star-shaped character. The Crease tool allows you to add small cuts to exaggerate things like bends and folds in your model. I'm just going to quickly use the clay tool again to make a mouth shape on the model. We're keeping it pretty basic and maybe a bit creepy by the looks of it. I'm going to add some color to the model next. Hopefully it makes this little guy more on the cute side. With the paint tool selected, I'm going to go to the bottom left and scroll to where the color picker is. I'll pick a nice purple, bring down the metalness and increase the roughness so the whole model isn't super shiny. I'll press the Paint All button since I want a base coat on the whole model. So you can see that the color has been applied to the entire thing. Next, I'm going to make a shinier orange color for the eyes and mouth. I'll decrease the radius of the tool so it isn't too unwieldy. And because my star isn't quite perfectly symmetrical, I'm going to turn off the symmetry setting and paint the eyes individually. Yep, he's looking pretty unsettling, but that's okay. Next, I'm going back to the color picker and using the eyedropper tool to bring back the purple I used before to clean up around the weird mouth. Now the paint is done, and I'm going to add some texture using the stamp tool. So again, we'll want to go to the bottom left, and there is a place to import different texture images. These are usually alpha textures, which are images that contain transparency information. You can easily find these kinds of images online, such as doing a Google image search for alpha textures. If I press the import button, I can choose to bring in these textures from my photos. Here I have a few saved. I'll just re-import one that I already have in Nomad Sculpt. You can see that I now have a duplicate, and I can remove this or any of the others by tapping and holding on an image and then choosing delete. I'm going to select this kind of ribbed texture to stamp onto my character. It takes a little getting used to, but you'll want to press and drag on your model with the stamp tool until the texture changes to the size you want. You can see I had some overlap on my first stamp, so I undid a few changes and then tried again. I'm just going to try out another stamp on, I guess, what are the arms of this character. He could still use a lot of TLC, but I'm going to export my star character for now. If you go to the project folder at the top left, then scroll down to export, you'll choose which file type you'd like. I am just going to go with OBJ for now, since it is a very common file type that is compatible with different programs. I'll just go to export OBJ, Then here it prompts me to send or save my model to a variety of locations. I'm going to save it to my files and store it locally on my iPad. I'll give it a name. I guess Star Dude will have to do. And now if I go back to the project folder and scroll back up to import, I can bring my model into a new project. It might be a bit difficult to tell, but here I have imported my model into a new project. I can now continue editing my character using Nomad Sculpt, or I can import it into a different software. Manipulating 3D scans of objects is just one of the steps that we cover in our AR Production Pathways learning materials. Please visit our Shared Spaces website or YouTube channel to find other videos for your augmented reality workflow.